The streets of Nairobi had always been loud, but lately, they echoed with something deeper than traffic and market cries. It was frustration. It was anger. It was fear. And above all, it was a longing for something no one had seen in decades. The youth roamed the alleys with their heads down, their diplomas crumpled in plastic folders, their hopes slowly eaten away by the same promises they had inherited from their fathers. Jobs were gone. Farms were dry. The rich had built walls, and the poor were left shouting through locked gates. In the offices of politicians, air conditioners hummed while decisions were signed in secret. Foreign companies dug into the ground, shipping out minerals while leaving dust behind. Mega projects, decorated with foreign flags and glossy billboards, rose up across the skyline. But beneath them, mothers sold boiled maize to survive, and children studied by candlelight. The gap between what Kenya looked like on paper and what it felt like in real life had never been wider. The breaking point came in silence. A young man named Kevin collapsed outside a government building, clutching a note that read, "I have applied for 117 jobs. I have never received a call." The photo of his body with the letter still in his hand spread faster than any politician's speech ever had. That was a spark. Suddenly, it wasn't just Kevin. It was all of them. Every youth, every unemployed graduate, every farmer struggling with fake seeds and dry soil, every mother turned nurse because her child had never seen a real doctor. Something had to give. And what came next didn't begin in Parliament or on the news. It began in whispers, in WhatsApp groups and matatas, in barbershops and classrooms. A name began to float across the conversations like a forgotten spell. Traoré. Ibrahim Traoré. They had watched him from afar. At first, it was just curiosity. A young soldier in Burkina Faso standing against the very forces that had swallowed their own leaders. He refused to kneel. He refused to sell. He spoke little, but when he did, it was clear, simple, and sharp. They saw how he reclaimed gold mines, how he had expelled those who came to steal under the mask of help. They saw how the people in Ouagadougou walked taller now, how they planted, built, organized. And somewhere deep inside, Kenyans asked themselves a question they've been too afraid to say aloud. What if he could help us too? It started as a joke in a viral tweet. Let's borrow Traoré for a few months, just until we sort things out. But the tweet caught fire. It wasn't a joke anymore. The feeling spread like a fever. Journalists debated it on the radio. Artists painted murals of him on downtown walls. Songs were written. School children mimicked his speeches during class presentations. Then one day, in a small village in Kiambu, an old man named Baraka gathered the elders beneath a giant magumo tree. They spoke in turns. They remembered times when dignity had meant something, when leadership wasn't just about power, but about responsibility. And after many hours of silence, they reached a decision. They would send a letter, not to a government, not through diplomacy, but directly from the people of Kenya to Ibrahim Traoré. Word spread fast across every county. People lined up to sign, not on an online petition, not through a website, but with pens on paper. Thousands, then tens of thousands, then millions. Signatures filled entire halls, carried by motorbikes and matatas to Nairobi. There, a council of citizens, chosen by vote, not by title, wrapped the pages in Kenya cloth and entrusted them to a delegation heading west. As the plane lifted from Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, carrying the hopes of a nation in a canvas bag, Kenya held its breath. In Ouagadougou, Traoré received the delegation without fanfare. No cameras, no protocol. Just a quiet room, a wooden table, and a man in fatigues who listened more than he spoke. He read every word of the letter in silence. His fingers brushed over the inked names, some written with shaky hands, some smudged with dust. He looked up and said, "They don't need a president. They need belief." 2 days later, he stood before the press. His message was simple. I am not coming to rule. I am coming to listen, to walk beside them, not ahead. And with that, the wheels were set in motion. The African Union tried to intervene. They issued statements, warned of overreach, threatened sanctions, but none of it mattered because the people had decided. When Traoré landed in Kenya, no red carpet awaited him, no honor guards, just people. Thousands lining the roads, waving flags, singing, not for a hero, but for a companion. He traveled not in a convoy, but in a van. He stopped at markets, sat in churches, met with students in rundown classrooms, listened to workers in sugarcane fields. He took no photos, gave no grand speeches. Instead, he asked questions. Why is this land not feeding you? Why are your doctors working abroad? Why is your steel imported when your soil has iron? And slowly, the people began to respond, not with complaints, but with action. Schools formed night classes for unemployed youth. Farmers met in co-ops. Welders fixed abandoned machines. Students designed water systems for dry villages. Traoré didn't hand out money. He handed out plans, not blueprints from foreign consultants, but simple, local models. He showed how Burkina Faso built its own tractors, how it made bricks from its own clay, how it used what it had instead of begging for what it didn't. He gave them the most dangerous gift of all, belief. And that belief began to spread beyond Kenya's borders. The belief took root like something buried deep under African soil, dormant for generations, now breaking to the surface. The energy was no longer just emotional, it was practical. Youth groups began organizing cleanups in towns that had been forgotten. Former political rivals in counties like Kakamega and Garissa sat across from each other, not to negotiate power, but to build roads together, using stones from their rivers and labor from their own communities. In Nakuru, mechanics turned a scrapyard into a factory floor, guided by blueprints printed off dusty flash drives. They melted metal and reshaped it into parts for water pumps. Across the Rift Valley, women who had once sold firewood now ran workshops, teaching solar panel installation. In Turkana, where the wind was strong but power lines rare, wind turbines made from motorcycle rims and plastic tanks began to spin slowly in the heat. A quiet kind of revolution was underway. Traoré stayed silent most days. He would walk through towns with a notebook, sketching what he saw. He didn't bark orders. He didn't promise miracles. He asked questions, took notes, and pointed people to what they already had, already knew, already were. In a small town outside Kizii, a young man approached him with trembling hands and tears in his eyes. "My father called you a madman." He said, "Africa needs help, not pride." But yesterday, he joined us to dig irrigation channels for the first time in his life. Traoré smiled and replied softly, "He's right. Pride without action is nothing. But when action comes from pride, it changes everything." Not everyone was pleased. In boardrooms from London to Washington, CEOs watched the news with clenched jaws. Reports came in from their representatives on the ground. Mining contracts were being reviewed, land leases were being questioned, supply chains were being disrupted. Worst of all, a new mood was spreading among the people. They were no longer begging. They were building. And then came the blow they hadn't expected. Kenya's government, under massive public pressure, passed a series of emergency laws that prioritized local industries, banned the export of raw materials without processing, and redirected foreign aid funds into community-run cooperatives. A special commission was formed, not of politicians, but of engineers, farmers, students, and elders. They called it Tumaini, meaning hope. Traoré was asked to chair it. He refused. Instead, he nominated a 26-year-old woman from Machakos who had invented a cheap, reusable water filtration system during university, but had never found funding. Her name was Akinang. She became a symbol overnight, not because she was perfect, but because she was real. She knew the weight of being ignored. And now she stood in the center of the storm, determined to show what was possible when people like her were finally seen. International media tried to spin the events. They called it a populist wave, a temporary fantasy. But inside Kenya, no one cared about their headlines anymore. They were too busy working. Across the country, makeshift training centers popped up. Retired craftsmen who had once been discarded were now teaching workshops. Doctors who had left for Australia or Canada returned to train young medics in rural clinics. Schools ran evening programs for adults who wanted to learn again. The country was becoming a classroom, a workshop, a movement. And Traoré? He stayed in the background, always walking, always listening. When asked why he wasn't leading more visibly, he simply said, "My job is to disappear once you remember who you are." It wasn't long before the transformation caught the eyes of other nations. Tanzania sent a delegation to observe the new farming cooperatives. Uganda invited Kenya's local energy teams to share their wind turbine models. Ethiopia opened its border to exchange engineers. For the first time in decades, East Africa wasn't meeting in five-star hotels to talk about unity. It was building it, brick by brick, trench by trench. But as the movement grew, so did the resistance. In Nairobi, a quiet alliance of powerful businessmen, foreign contractors, and loyal politicians began a plot. They called Traoré dangerous, a destabilizer, a threat to order. They spread rumors that he was planning a coup, that he wanted to divide the nation, that he was secretly building a militia. Some news outlets picked up the lies. Others stayed silent. But the people weren't fooled. Traoré didn't hide. He called a public meeting at Uhuru Park. No security, no stage, just him standing on a wooden crate with a microphone. "I came because you called," he said. "I stayed because I saw something that had been buried too long. And if I leave tomorrow, I leave knowing this truth. You don't need saving. You needed reminding." That day, thousands showed up not to hear him speak, but to speak themselves. Farmers shared crop rotations. Carpenters proposed school construction designs. Midwives outlined rural health care plans. The crowd became a parliament without walls, a government without fear. Something deeper had changed. Kenya was no longer waiting for someone to solve its problems. It had begun solving itself. The weeks passed, and what had begun as a moment was slowly turning into a movement, no longer limited to city centers or rural farms. The energy had found its way into every corner of the country. There were no uniforms, no official badges, but the people had found something far more powerful than a flag or a leader. They had found rhythm, and with that rhythm came trust. In Kisumu, fishermen who had once competed over shrinking waters began forming collectives to share catches and invest in better nets. In the forests of Mount Elgon, reforestation teams sprang up, made of ex-poachers who had turned protectors. In Nairobi's most neglected neighborhoods, former gang members joined forces with teachers to build learning centers from discarded shipping containers. There were still challenges. Power blackouts continued. Inflation lingered. Some parts of the country resisted the wave, clinging to the comfort of old habits and easy blame. But those were no longer the headlines. The stories that matter were quieter, harder to capture, and deeply human. A grandmother in Meru teaching sewing to teenage mothers, a mechanic in Eldoret converting tuk-tuks to run on solar batteries, a nurse in Kilify returning from abroad to train local midwives unpaid. Ibrahim Traoré never allowed himself to be glorified. Whenever murals of his face began to appear, he quietly asked for them to be painted over with scenes of community projects instead. His message was consistent and unshaken. If I become the symbol, then you have missed the meaning. He continued to walk, to observe, and guide from the side. He spoke only when necessary. And when he did, it was always to highlight someone else's idea, someone else's achievement. It was not humility for the sake of image. It was strategy. He knew the dangers of personality cults. He knew that true change had to be carried in the hands of many, not in the shadow of one. The rest of the continent began to listen more closely. In Dar es Salaam, students held debates about whether West Africa could follow Kenya's lead. In Bamako, farmers sent letters to Traoré asking for guidance on how to form cooperatives. In Harare, a group of unemployed engineers began building a prototype tractor using parts scavenged from old Russian trucks. They called it the Umoja One, but as the light spread, so did the shadows. In private lounges in Dubai and Geneva, contracts were reviewed with cold eyes. Projects worth billions suddenly stalled. Mines halted, ports renegotiated, pharmaceutical monopolies weakened by local alternatives. Kenya had become a problem. Worse, it had become an example. The pressure intensified. Threats came, veiled in diplomatic language. Loan agreements suddenly triggered. Credit ratings downgraded. Flights delayed. Conferences canceled. But the more the outside world tried to pull the reins, the more the people inside refused to budge. In a quiet midnight session, A group of international investors offered Traoré a deal, $10 billion in development funds in exchange for stepping back, publicly denouncing the People's Movement and allowing international advisors to take over the National Commission. He didn't respond with anger. He simply stood, looked each of them in the eye, and said, "What you offer us in gold, we will build from clay." Then he walked out. It was at that moment that the movement became irreversible. The next morning, the youth of Kenya staged a silent march. No banners, no slogans, just footsteps. From every major town they walked, converging on Nairobi. By the time they arrived, the crowd stretched beyond sight. They stood in silence for hours, holding only one thing in their hands: tools, hammers, books, seeds, stethoscopes, a symbol of what they were building. No speech was given. No microphone was needed. That image alone traveled across the globe through every screen, every phone, every heart. The world watched in awe, some with fear, others with tears. Traoré, standing among the crowd, whispered to a young girl beside him, "When the people walk without fear, no force can stop them." Still, the threats didn't stop. An anonymous warning came one night to the small guest house where he stayed. Leave the country within 48 hours or face consequences. Armed mercenaries had been seen at the border. His advisors urged him to fly out immediately, but he refused. "I will not leave quietly. If I must go, let the whole world know why." So the next morning, he held a press conference in the middle of Jacamba Market, surrounded by farmers selling avocados and school children in uniforms. He exposed the threats, named the corporations, cited the contracts. Then he looked into the cameras and said, "This land belongs to its people, not to your debts, not to your deals. We will build with or without your permission." It was the most watched broadcast in Kenya's history. It was also the most dangerous moment of his stay. That same night, a convoy of unmarked vehicles was spotted near his residence. But before any move could be made, thousands of locals formed a human wall around the house. Not armed, not violent, just standing, singing. Some held candles, others held hands. They stayed all night. No attack came. Instead, something broke in the silence of that standoff, an understanding that Kenya had changed, that no bullet could kill what had already awakened. By now, the question wasn't whether Kenya could change. It had already changed. The deeper question, the one that kept leaders up at night from Addis Ababa to Brussels, was whether the change would spread. Because the fire was no longer just about policies or projects. It had become something older, more primal. A reawakening of the African soul, a return to the stubborn truth that a people who believe in themselves are the hardest control. In the months that followed, something unexpected happened. Other African nations began sending delegations to Nairobi, not presidents or ministers, but of teachers, builders, youth leaders, healers, farmers. They came not with demands, but with notebooks and tools. And what they found was not a utopia, but a country in motion, one that had stopped pretending to be saved and instead had chosen to get its hands dirty. Workshops opened in old stadiums. Factories reopened with machines run by volunteers until salaries could be paid again. Food cooperatives replaced monopolies. University students ran free weekend classes for primary schools. Every day brought something new. A machine fixed, a well dug, a school rebuilt. Nothing was perfect, but everything was possible. Traoré remained at the center of it all, yet somehow invisible. He declined every interview, refused every award. When journalists tried to corner him, he smiled and redirected them toward community leaders. It became a joke in local media. The man who led a movement by refusing to lead it. Still, pressure mounted from outside. International agencies threatened to cut aid. Embassies warned citizens against traveling to Kenya. Economic experts published grim predictions. But the people were already past fear. When one bank threatened to pull out, a network of community savings groups offered to replace its services. When a global food supplier cut deliveries, thousands of Kenyans volunteered to harvest together, and food was transported by boda in long convoys stretching for kilometers. The country had become its own safety net. It was messy, slow, imperfect, but it was real and it was theirs. One night, during a storm in the hills of Murenge, Traoré sat under a tin roof with a group of elders. They shared roasted maize and tea as lightning cracked in the distance. An old woman named Mama Teresia looked him in the eye and said, "You've done something strange. You've made us remember who we were before the world told us who to be." He didn't answer immediately. He let the rain speak for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't bring you a new truth. I only asked the question your hearts had already answered." That same month, as news spread across the continent, voices began rising from other places. In Senegal, students marched with signs saying, "Let us build like Kenya." In Ghana, a movement called back to soil gained momentum. In South Africa, workers' unions quoted Traoré's speeches and demanded land audits. The African Union was forced to acknowledge what they had ignored. In an emergency summit, leaders met in Addis Ababa to debate the Kenya phenomenon. Some condemned it, others admired it. None could deny it. In private rooms, attempts were made to co-opt the energy. Donors offered money with new conditions. Conferences were proposed to guide the movement. Even former politicians in Kenya tried to re-enter the stage, wearing new clothes and new promises. But the people weren't buying it. They had become allergic to speeches. They listened now only to actions. A leader's value was measured by what they built, not what they said. Titles meant nothing. Sweat meant everything. And through it all, Traoré continued to walk, to teach, to fade into background. He visited prisons to speak with inmates about rehabilitation through labor. He joined quiet meetings with orphanages to help design child-centered economies. He appeared unexpectedly at night schools to read poetry with janitors. He wasn't playing a role. He was living a truth. He wasn't saving Kenya. Kenya was saving itself. Yet, danger still lingered in the air. The forces had fed off dependency. Debt and chaos were not gone. They were watching, waiting for fatigue, for cracks to appear, for division to return. And one evening, that crack nearly came. A rumor spread that Traoré was planning to take over as head of state, replacing Kenya's president with himself. It wasn't true, but lies move faster than facts. Within hours, hashtags trended, tensions rose, and the calm was shaken. The government, though publicly supportive, felt threatened. Intelligence briefings warned of unrest. There were talks of quietly expelling him to avoid political imbalance. Traoré, upon hearing the rumors, did not react with anger or defensiveness. He called a public forum the next day. In a crowded open-air space in Thika, he took the stage and said only this: "I am not your president. I will never ask to be. I am not your prophet. I do not want to be followed. I am your reminder. And when you no longer need reminding, I will leave." Then he stepped off the stage and disappeared from the city. For 3 days, no one knew where he was. Rumors flew, but in truth, he had traveled to a forgotten village near the border, where no cameras reached, to help build a dam alongside farmers who had lost their crops. No interviews, no speeches, just work, just presence. When word finally reached the media, it wasn't through a press release. It came from a photo taken by a 10-year-old boy who posted it online. Traoré, barefoot, muddy, smiling, helping carry stones on his back. The caption read, "He didn't leave, he just moved to where help was needed." And suddenly, the tension broke. The lies collapsed. The people, reminded once again, rose stronger than before. Months had passed, and the transformation was no longer just in action, but in language, in the way people spoke about their lives, their country, and their place in the world. Kenyans no longer asked, "Who will fix this?" They asked, "When do we begin?" That subtle shift, almost invisible at first, had become the new foundation of a country reborn. By now, Traoré had faded almost completely from the headlines. He refused interviews, ignored invites from foreign institutions, and declined honors even from Pan-African organizations. He had become a paradox, the most influential figure in East Africa and the quietest. His name was everywhere, but his presence was humble, scattered, invisible in the way roots are invisible beneath a forest. He lived in a small home on the outskirts of Nairobi, waking up before sunrise to join early workers in maize fields or accompany children on the walk to school. Sometimes he spoke, sometimes not. When he did, it was always to ask questions. Is this the best way to use your soil? Have you taught the next generation what you know? Are you building something that will stand when you are gone? One day, a group of international journalists managed to track him down. They found him sitting on a wooden bench, watching local children play football barefoot. One of them asked, "Don't you want to return to Burkina Faso? Your country needs you, too." He looked up gently and replied, "They don't need me. They need themselves, just like here. My work is to vanish when memory returns." His answer became legend. Meanwhile, the systems built during the early waves of the movement had grown into something deeper. Local governments had been restructured. Political candidates were now chosen not by parties, but by community votes that evaluated what the person had built, not what they had promised. Public audits became street events, where villagers listened to yearly budgets read aloud and questioned them line by line. The education system shifted. 2. Students no longer memorized foreign history alone. They studied their grandparents' survival strategies, their mother's wisdom, their own community's contributions. Lessons in farming, ethics, building, conflict resolution, and indigenous medicine became core subjects. Exams no longer decided futures. Projects did. It wasn't a return to the past. It was a reclamation of it, a blending of ancestral knowledge with practical innovation. Solar panels made with recycled plastics, housing designed with ancient ventilation systems, water filtration based on old charcoal methods refined with modern science. Everything was connected now, nothing wasted. And in this new rhythm, the rest of the continent began to move. Sierra Leone declared land sovereignty laws. Namibia launched its own People's Commission for Industrial Recovery. Zambia's rural women organized the largest local textile exchange in southern Africa. And in each of these movements, somewhere in the background, there was a quote, a photo, a story about Kenya, and about a man who never stayed still. But not all stories have clean endings. One morning, Traoré vanished completely. His house was found empty, no note, no trace. Some believed he had returned secretly to Burkina Faso. Others thought he had simply moved to another corner of the continent, as he always did. A few whispered that maybe, just maybe, he had gone where no one could follow. Into legend, search parties were sent. Messages circulated. Governments quietly inquired, but no one found him. Only stories remained. A child in Bungoma said she saw him fixing a bicycle outside her school. A fisherman in Lamu claimed he shared a bench with him one dawn. A market woman in Kitale swore he bought bananas from her 2 days after the disappearance. The truth didn't matter anymore, because by then, the people had truly taken hold of the movement. They had stepped fully into their own story. They had understood, perhaps for the first time in generations, that the power to rise had always been within them, and that real leaders didn't teach them how to follow, but how to lead themselves. Years later, a mural appeared in the middle of Mombasa. It showed no face, just a silhouette walking into the distance, carrying a hoe on his shoulder. Above it were words written in Swahili. Hakataka kuumfam. Alitaka tutukumbuke kuwa sisi ni watu huru. He didn't want to be king. He only wanted us to remember that we are free people. And with that, the story was no longer about Ibrahim Traoré. It was about the people. It was about Kenya, and about what becomes possible when a nation remembers who it is and dares to walk forward without waiting for permission. Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories about injustice and comeback victories that will restore your faith in standing up for what's right.